The little green light on the electronic lock blinked, signaling the room was empty. I sighed, dragging my cleaning cart into the dark, air-conditioned silence of the presidential suite. I shouldn't be here on a Tuesday night. But debt doesn't sleep, and neither do I. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the hallway noise. I leaned against my cart for a second, flexing my toes inside my sensible, ugly black work shoes. They felt like they were filled with broken glass. This was my second double shift in 3 days, and my body was screaming at me to go home, curl up with a cheap bottle of wine, and forget that my credit score was currently lower than my morale. "Get it done, Denise," I whispered to the empty room. "Get it done, get paid, Sue Marcus." I pushed off the cart and rolled it across the plush carpet. The suite was massive, a sprawling landscape of Italian leather furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the neon pulse of Seoul. But I wasn't looking at the view. I was looking at the tablet on my cart. Room 4001. Status, vacant/dirty. That meant a quick turnover. Change the sheets, scrub the marble, restock the minibar. Easy. But as I passed the grand piano, I stopped. The air here wasn't cold and sterile like the hallway. It was thick, humid, and it smelled distinctive. Underneath the standard hotel scent of lemon polish, there was something heavier. Expensive sandalwood soap, masculine and spicy, mixed with something sharp and metallic that tickled the back of my throat. I frowned. I looked toward the master bathroom. The double doors were cracked open, and a thick white fog was rolling out along the floorboards, curling around the legs of the antique vanity. Someone was in there. My heart did a little stutter step in my chest. If a guest was in here, the system should have flagged it. I should be locked out. I took a hesitant step forward, my hands gripping the handle of my cart until my knuckles turned white. Through the crack in the doors, I saw movement, a shadow shifting against the steam-fogged glass of the shower. I froze. Welcome back to Evie's Mafia romance collections. Tonight, we're checking into the most expensive suite in Seoul, but we aren't here for the room service. We're here for the danger. If you love stories about mistaken identity, dangerous men in towels, and women who don't back down, make sure you subscribe and like this video. Get comfortable, lock your doors, and let's see what happens when you walk into the wrong room at the right time. Let's begin. The bathroom door swung open before I could even turn around. A cloud of steam billowed out, hitting me with a wall of moist heat. And from that white haze, a nightmare stepped out. He was massive. That was my first thought. He took up the entire doorway, his broad shoulders practically brushing the frame. He was soaking wet, water dripping from his jet-black hair and running in rivulets down a chest that looked like it was carved from stone. But it wasn't the muscles that made my breath hitch. It was the ink. Intricate, terrifying tattoos covered nearly every inch of his golden bronze skin. A Korean dragon with obsidian scales wound its way around his neck, its jaws resting over his collarbone. Dark waves and tigers snarled across his ribs and arms. The ink was so detailed, so dark against his skin that the dragon seemed to writhe with every breath he took. He was wearing nothing but a stark white hotel towel, slung dangerously low on his hips. The whiteness of the fabric was blinding against the darkness of his tattoos. But there was another color too. Red. Bright, angry crimson was seeping through a thick gauze bandage wrapped haphazardly around his midsection. The water dripping off his torso wasn't clear. It was pink, pooling on the expensive marble floor around his bare feet. The metallic smell I'd noticed earlier hit me full force now. It wasn't copper, it was blood. I stared up at his face. He was devastatingly handsome, with high cheekbones and a jawline that could cut glass, but his eyes were the scariest thing I had ever seen. They were pitch black, cold, and dead. They didn't widen in surprise at seeing a maid. They narrowed. And then I saw what was in his right hand. A gun. Black, sleek, and fitted with a silencer. My throat closed up. I tried to speak, to say housekeeping, to apologize, to beg. But my voice died before it reached my lips. He didn't look like a guest who had been disturbed. He looked like a predator who had just been cornered. He took a step toward me, the water and blood splashing softly. He raised the gun, leveling it directly at my heart. His hand didn't shake. Not even a millimeter. He reached behind me with his free hand, the movement a blur of speed and violence, and slammed the heavy bathroom door shut. The lock clicked with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the small, steamy room. He loomed over me, smelling of blood and soap and death. "If you scream, you die," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp that vibrated in my chest. "If you run, you die. Put the towels down." The towels hit the floor with a soft, muffled thud that seemed incredibly loud in the sudden silence of the bathroom. I raised my hands slowly, palms open, showing him I had nothing else. No weapon, no radio, just calloused hands that smelled of bleach and lemon polish. "Okay," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Okay, towels are down. I'm not screaming." I stared at the gun. It was a dark, unblinking eye staring right at my chest. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I was terrified, yes. The adrenaline was making my knees feel like water, but beneath the terror there was a spark of something else. Something hot and jagged. Anger. I was exhausted. My feet were swollen. I had just spent 4 hours scrubbing the grime out of the grout in the lobby restrooms, and now, when I was finally supposed to have an easy turnover in the act, I was being held at gunpoint by a naked man who looked like he'd walked out of a graphic novel about the Yakuza. It wasn't fair. Nothing about my life in the last 2 years had been fair. "Turn around," he commanded. I hesitated. Turning my back on a man with a gun felt like suicide. I said, "Turn around," he growled, stepping closer. He was swaying. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift in his balance, like a tree catching a breeze. But then I saw it clearly. His knuckles, the ones gripping the gun, were white, but the rest of his skin was turning a sickly shade of gray beneath the bronzed tan. The vibrant ink of the dragon on his chest seemed to stand out starkly against the pallor of his skin, the black scales looking like they were floating on milk. "You're hurt," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "You need a doctor." Silence. He barked. The effort seemed to cost him. A fresh bead of sweat rolled down his temple, mixing with the shower water. He grimaced, his lips pulling back to reveal gritted white teeth. The movement caused his body to jerk, and for a split second, the gun dipped. Just an inch. But in that same second, the white towel knotted at his hip slipped. It didn't fall completely, thank God, but it dipped dangerously low, clinging to him by sheer friction and luck. It revealed the sharp, sculpted lines of his hips and the deep V-line of muscle that disappeared into the white fabric. Even in my terror, my eyes betrayed me. He was, objectively, the most physically imposing man I had ever seen. Every inch of him was hard muscle and intricate art, but the beauty was ruined by the carnage. The movement had torn something loose. The blood that had been seeping through the gauze suddenly gushed. It bloomed across the white bandage like a horrific flower, dark red and thick. It ran down his stomach, over the hard ridges of his abs, and soaked into the top of the towel. The smell hit me then, overpowering the expensive sandalwood soap. It was the smell of a butcher shop. Hot metallic copper. It filled the small room, clogging my nose and making my stomach turn. He hissed in pain, his free hand clutching his side, his fingers digging into the wound as if he could hold the blood inside by sheer force of will. He squeezed his eyes shut for a heartbeat, his breathing coming in ragged, wet gasps. "Phone," he choked out, opening his eyes. The darkness in them was hazy now, unfocused. "Give me your phone." I froze. My phone was in my apron pocket. It was an old model with a cracked screen, but it was my lifeline. It had my calendar, my contacts, the terrifying emails from the debt collectors, and the only photos I had left of my life before Marcus burned it to the ground. "If I give it to you, will you let me go?" I asked, bargaining like a fool. He raised the gun again. The silencer looked enormous. "Phone." "Now." I reached into my pocket with a shaking hand and pulled it out. I held it out to him. He snatched it from me with a wet, bloody hand, smearing crimson across the cracked screen. He didn't check to see if I had dialed anyone. He didn't turn it off. He simply dropped it onto the marble floor and brought his bare heel down on it. Crunch. The sound of the glass shattering was sickeningly final. He ground his heel into the device, twisting his foot until the plastic casing cracked and the screen was nothing but dust and shards. "Now," he wheezed, looking at me with glazed eyes. "Now nobody knows you are here." A chill went down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. He was right. I was working the night shift. My supervisor, Mrs. Kim, was asleep in her office in the basement. Nobody checked on us unless there was a complaint. I could disappear in this room, and no one would look for me until shift change at 6 a.m. I looked at the crushed remains of my phone, and a wave of bitterness washed over me. Marcus, my ex-husband, had destroyed my credit, my reputation, and my trust. He had left me drowning in legal fees, forcing me to scrub toilets to pay for crimes I didn't commit. I had survived that. I had survived the humiliation of the bank seizing my car. I had survived the eviction notices. I am not dying in a hotel bathroom, I thought, a fierce, cold resolve settling in my gut. I did not claw my way back from zero just to bleed out on a marble floor because some gangster couldn't handle his business. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my voice hardening. "I wasn't going to call the police. I just want to leave." He tried to sneer at me, tried to summon that terrifying, predatory glare, but his body was done. The adrenaline that had been propping him up vanished. His eyes rolled back in his head. He mumbled, the words slurring into nothingness. He didn't fall forward. He slumped. His knees buckled, and he slid down the wall, the wet skin of his back squeaking against the polished tile. A wide, dark smear of blood painted the wall behind him, a gruesome streak of red marking his descent. He hit the floor with a heavy, boneless thud. His head lolled to the side, resting against the bathroom cabinet. The gun clattered from his hand, skidding across the wet tiles and coming to a stop halfway between us. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the sound of his breathing. It was awful, shallow, rattling breaths that sounded like he was drowning in his own lungs. I stood there, frozen. This was it. The movie moment. The bad guy was down. The weapon was loose. I looked at the door. It was locked, but the latch was on the inside. I could turn it, run through the suite, and be in the hallway in 10 seconds. I could run to the elevator. I could scream for security. I could be safe. I looked at the gun. I should kick it away, just in case. Then, I looked at him. He looked younger now that the aggression was gone from his face. The tattoos, so terrifying moments ago, just looked like art on a broken canvas. The towel had slipped further, revealing a hip bone that jutted out sharply, but I wasn't looking at that. I was looking at the pool of blood expanding beneath him. It was moving fast, seeking the grout lines, creeping toward my shoes. He was dying, right now, in front of me. If I ran, he would be dead before security got up here. And if security got up here, and he was who I thought he was, a man with a silenced pistol and dragon tattoos, the police would be involved. There would be an investigation. My name would be on a report. And his enemies? The people who did this to him? If I ran out there screaming, who was to say they weren't watching the hallway? Who was to say they weren't the ones who hacked the hotel system to show the room as vacant? If I walked out that door, I might be walking straight into a bullet. But if I stayed... I looked at the wound again. The jagged tear in his side was pulsing. He let out a low, pained groan, his brow furrowing in unconscious agony. My mother used to say I had a fixer's heart. It was why I stayed with Marcus for so long, trying to fix his gambling, his lying. It was why I was currently paying off debts that weren't mine. I couldn't walk away from a mess. I couldn't walk away from suffering. Stupid, I whispered to myself. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I looked at his face again. Even pale and dying, there was something about him. A strength, a defiance. He had fought to stay standing until the very last second. I took a deep breath, inhaling the copper scent of blood and the steam. "Damn it, Denise," I hissed. I moved. First, survival. I stepped over the expanding puddle of blood and kicked the gun. It slid across the floor and spun under the vanity cabinet, far out of his reach. Second, security. I turned to the bathroom door, but instead of opening it, I engaged the deadbolt. Click. I wasn't locking myself in with a monster, I was locking the rest of the world out. I turned back to the unconscious man on the floor. I knelt down in the water and the blood, ruining my uniform, and put my hands on him. His skin was burning hot, feverish, despite the pallor. "All right, Shadow King," I muttered, grabbing a stack of clean hand towels. "Let's see if you're worth the trouble." I looked down at the unconscious mountain of muscle and ink on the bathroom floor and realized my night was about to get significantly harder. "Okay," I huffed, wiping my damp hands on my apron. "Okay, Denise. You handle linen deliveries. You handle inventory. You can handle one unconscious bleeding giant." I was lying to myself. He was built like a tank and currently weighed about as much as a Hyundai. But I couldn't leave him on the wet tiles. The water was mixing with the blood, making it impossible to see how bad the damage really was. I needed light, and I needed dry ground. I grabbed him under the arms, my hands slipping against his hot, slick skin. I grunted, digging my heels into the marble, and heaved. He didn't budge. "Come on," I groaned, straining until my back popped. "Work with me here, big guy." I dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, out of the bathroom and onto the thick, expensive Persian rug in the center of the living area. By the time I dropped his upper body onto the soft wool, I was sweating through my uniform and panting like I'd just run a marathon. He groaned low in his throat, his head lolling back, exposing the dragon tattoo on his throat. I didn't have time to admire the art. I turned and sprinted to the minibar. I tore open the cabinet and bypassed the sodas and the tiny wines. I grabbed the bottle of Crystal Head vodka, the $60 stuff. I cracked the seal, the smell of sharp, high-proof alcohol cutting through the scent of blood in the room. "Put it on his tab," I muttered. Next, I ran to my cart still parked by the door. I grabbed my supervisor's kit. It wasn't a medical bag, but it was close enough. Sewing needles, black thread, danetchmosiziem, small scissors, and a tube of superglue for broken shoe heels. I rushed back to him. The blood was already soaking into the cream-colored rug. I knelt beside him, my knees sinking into the wool. "This is going to hurt," I told him, even though he was out cold. "But honestly, you probably deserve it." I unscrewed the vodka cap and tipped the bottle. I didn't drizzle it. I poured it. A steady, freezing stream of 80-proof alcohol directly into the jagged, open gash on his side. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. His eyes snapped open. He didn't scream. He didn't gasp. He exploded into motion. His body jerked violently, arching off the floor like he'd been electrocuted. His hand shot out with the speed of a striking cobra and clamped around my wrist. His grip was crushing, like a steel vise. He twisted my arm, yanking me down until my face was inches from his. His eyes were wide, wild, and focused, with a terrifying clarity. The black pupils were blown wide, swallowing the iris. "Who sent you?" He snarled, his voice a guttural roar. "Who?" My heart hammered against my ribs, but the pain in my wrist sparked that familiar defensive anger. I was tired, I was scared, and I was done being manhandled. Nobody sent me. Musclehead. I snapped, shouting right back in his face. "I'm the housekeeping supervisor. Now let go of my hand before I pour this alcohol in your eye instead of your wound." He froze. He blinked, the feral rage in his eyes faltering for a microsecond. He looked at my face, really looked at me, processing the uniform, the badge, and the bottle of vodka in my free hand. He looked at the needle and thread on the floor. The confusion on his face was almost comical. No one spoke to him like that. I could see it in the way his brow furrowed. He was used to assassins and soldiers, not angry women in sensible shoes. Slowly, deliberately, he loosened his grip. He didn't let go completely, but the bone-crushing pressure faded. He fell back against the rug, his chest heaving. "Housekeeping," he rasped, testing the word like it was a foreign language. "Yes. Housekeeping," I said, yanking my wrist free and rubbing the red marks his fingers had left. "And right now, I'm trying to keep you from dying on my rug. So, are you going to kill me, or are you going to let me sew you up?" He looked down at his side. The wound was clean now, the blood washed away by the vodka. But it was deep, too deep for a bandage. It was gaping open, weeping fresh blood with every beat of his heart. He looked back at me. The paranoia was still there, lurking in the depths of his dark eyes, but the aggression had dialed back to a simmer. "Do you have anesthesia?" he asked, his voice tight with pain. "I have vodka," I said, holding up the bottle. "And I have grit. Take your pick." He actually huffed. It might have been a laugh, or a groan of pain. "Do it." "Do what?" "Stitch it," he commanded. He grabbed a throw pillow from the sofa behind him and shoved it between his teeth. He stared up at the ceiling, his jaw clenched so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. "Do it." I took a deep breath. My hands were shaking. I forced them to stop. I threaded the needle with the black thread. It was thick, meant for heavy buttons, not human skin. "Don't move," I whispered. I leaned in. The heat coming off him was intense, radiating against my face. I could smell the vodka, the blood, and the musky scent of his skin. I pushed the needle through the edge of the wound. He didn't make a sound, but his entire body went rigid. The muscles of his abdomen slammed tight, hard as iron. I watched the ink of the tiger on his ribs distort as his skin pulled taut. He bit down on the pillow, his neck muscles straining like cords of wire. I pulled the thread through. "Talk to me," he ground out through the pillow, his eyes squeezed shut. "Distract me. What do you want me to say?" I asked, lining up the second stitch. My fingers brushed his skin. It was smooth, hot, and damp with sweat. The intimacy of it was disorienting. I was hurting him to save him, my hands deep in his personal space. "Name," he grunted. "Denise," I said, pushing the needle through again. This time a small hiss of air escaped his nose. "Denise Johnson." "Denise," he repeated. He opened his eyes. They were wet with pain, but they were locked on me. He wasn't looking at the ceiling anymore. He was watching my face. He was watching the sweat bead on my forehead. He was watching my lips purse in concentration. "You have steady hands. I used to sew my ex-husband's suits," I muttered, tying off a knot. He was too cheap to go to a tailor. Turns out he was saving his money for his mistress. "He is a fool," the man said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a cold certainty. "Yeah, well, tell me something I don't know." I wiped a smear of blood away from the wound with a clean towel. "What about you? Do you have a name, or should I just call you the dragon?" He watched me for a long moment. I could feel the weight of his assessment. He was deciding how much to give me. "Myung-Jin," he said finally. "Just Myung-Jin. No surname, no title." But the way he said it carried a weight that made the air in the room feel heavier. "Okay, Myung-Jin," I said softly. Last one. Deep breath. I drove the needle through one last time. He shuddered, a full-body tremor that vibrated into my own hands. I tied it off and snipped the thread with my scissors. I sat back on my heels, dropping the bloody needle onto the silver tray from the minibar. I was exhausted. My adrenaline was crashing, leaving me shaky and lightheaded. I grabbed a clean pillowcase I had pulled from the cart and tore it into strips. I lifted his hips. He helped me this time, arching his back with a groan, and wrapped the makeshift bandage tight around his waist. "There," I said, my voice quiet. "It's not pretty, but it'll hold." He lay there for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. The white bandage stood out starkly against his tanned skin and the dark, intricate tattoos. He looked battered. He looked dangerous. And for the first time, he looked human. He turned his head to look at me, His hair was drying now, messy black strands falling over his forehead. The terrifying void in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, profound exhaustion. "You should have run," he said. His voice was rough, barely a whisper. I looked at the bloody towels, the empty vodka bottle, and the gun still lying under the vanity in the bathroom. I looked at the man who could probably kill me with his bare hands even in this condition. "I know," I said. And I did. I knew I had crossed a line. I knew my life as a simple debt-ridden housekeeping supervisor was over. But looking at him, seeing the way he watched me, like I was the only real thing in the world, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Not yet. Myung-Jin was sitting up against the sofa, his eyes closed, the makeshift bandage stark white against his skin. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the city outside the thick glass. Then, a vibration buzzed against the floorboards. Myung-Jin's eyes snapped open. He reached for his pile of discarded bloody clothes and fished a small burner phone out of the slacks. He flipped it open. The screen washed his face in a harsh blue light for a split second before he snapped it shut. "They found me," he said. His voice was void of emotion, dead calm. "What?" I stood up, the bloody scissors still in my hand. "Who?" Before he could answer, the world ended. There was a loud thunk from the depths of the hotel's infrastructure, and the lights died. The AC unit groaned and spun down into silence. The sudden darkness was absolute, heavy and suffocating. A heartbeat later, the emergency system kicked in. Flash, darkness, flash, darkness. Red strobe lights pulsed in the hallway, their light bleeding through the gap under the door. The room was bathed in an intermittent blood-colored glow that made the shadows jump and dance like demons. "Power cut," Myung-Jin hissed, forcing himself to his feet. He swayed, clutching his side, his face twisting in pain in the flashing red light. "They're coming up. The elevators will be compromised. The stairs will be watched." He looked at me, his black eyes reflecting the rhythmic red pulses. "You need to hide. Under the bed. In the ventilation. Somewhere small." "And what about you?" I asked, watching him stumble toward the bathroom, presumably to retrieve the gun I'd kicked under the vanity. "I will buy you time," he said. "I'm the target. You can barely stand." I snapped, moving toward him. "You'll be dead before you pull the trigger." He retrieved the gun, checking the magazine with practiced, shaky hands. "It is not your concern." "It is my concern because this is my hotel," I said, grabbing his uninjured arm. His skin was burning up. "Listen to me. They expect you to be trapped. They cut the power to lock down the guest elevators and the smart locks. But they don't know the service override." He looked at me, the gun heavy in his hand. "Service override?" "I'm the supervisor," I said, my voice rising over the rising panic in my chest. "I have a biometric master key. It opens the heavy freight elevators in the north wing. They run on a separate generator for fire safety. It bypasses the lobby and goes straight to the loading dock." He hesitated. The red light flashed, illuminating the doubt on his face. Then another sound cut through the silence, a heavy muffled thump from the hallway. Then another, footsteps, heavy boots on thick carpet. "Lead the way," he whispered. I opened the door. The hallway was a nightmare tunnel. The red strobes were blinding, disorienting. The long corridor stretched out, empty and terrifying. "Lean on me," I whispered. He didn't argue. He draped his left arm over my shoulders. He was heavy, a solid wall of muscle and bone, but he held most of his weight off me, gritting his teeth against the agony in his side. We moved. I steered us away from the main elevators, heading toward the discreet gray door disguised as a wall panel near the ice machine. Flash. We took 3 steps. Darkness. We took 3 more. The silence was broken by a sound that made my blood run cold. Pfft. Pfft. Silenced gunshots. They were clearing the rooms. Breaching. And clearing. And they were getting closer, faster. Myung-Jin breathed, his weight increasing on my shoulders. He was fading. The exertion was tearing his stitches. We were 10 feet from the service door when the stairwell door at the far end of the hall burst open. A beam of a tactical flashlight sliced through the red darkness, sweeping the walls. Contact. A voice shouted. "In here." I gasped. I didn't have time for the service door. I yanked Myung-Jin to the left, swiping my keycard on the linen closet. The lock disengaged with a beep, and I shoved him inside, tumbling in after him. I pulled the door shut just as the hallway outside erupted with the sound of heavy boots running. The linen closet was tiny. It was floor-to-ceiling shelves of towels, sheets, and robes. There was barely room for one person, let alone two. Myung-Jin was pressed back against the shelves, and I was pressed against him. There was zero space. My chest was flattened against his bare, tattooed torso. His legs were tangled with mine. The door clicked shut, plunging us into total darkness. The only light came from the thin crack at the bottom of the door, where the red strobe flashed rhythmically, casting a sliver of bloody light across his feet. "Shh," he breathed. He didn't need to tell me. I stopped breathing. The footsteps pounded past the door. I could hear the radio chatter. Clear. Next room. Check the vents. Myung-Jin's body was a furnace against mine. The smell of him filled the tiny space. The sharp, antiseptic sting of the expensive vodka I'd poured on him, mixed with the metallic tang of blood and the heavy, masculine scent of sweat and sandalwood. His hand came up, resting on the back of my head, pressing my face into the crook of his neck to keep me steady. His skin was damp. I could feel his heart hammering against my chest. Thump, 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 thump. Fast, erratic, but strong. The intimacy was suffocating. I could feel the rise and fall of his ribs with every shallow breath. I could feel the hard ridge of the gun pressed between our bodies. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the shell of my ear. "Stay quiet," he barely whispered, the sound a mere vibration of air. His breath ghosted over my neck, hot and desperate. A shiver violently ripped through me that had nothing to do with fear. It was electric. In the dark, pressed against a dying warlord, with death marching outside the door, I felt hyper-alive. Every nerve ending was singing. We stood there for what felt like an eternity. I was drowning in his scent, my hands clutching his forearms to keep us both upright. He didn't move. He was a statue, listening with a predator's intensity. Finally, the voices faded down the hall toward the presidential suite. "They're at the suite," he whispered, pulling back slightly. "We have seconds." He pushed the door open. The hallway was empty again, the red lights still pulsing their silent warning. We stumbled out. I dragged him the last 5 feet to the service elevator. I slammed my thumb against the biometric scanner. Access granted. The heavy steel doors slid open with a groan. We fell inside, and I punched the button for the loading dock/basement 2. The doors closed just as a shout echoed from down the hall. A flashlight beam hit the closing metal, but it was too late. We were descending. Myung-Jin slid down the wall of the elevator, his strength finally giving out. "Vehicle," he wheezed. "I need a vehicle." "The hotel vans are keyed to the valet stand," I said, panic rising again. "We can't go there." "No," he grunted, reaching into the waistband of his pants. He pulled out a small flat magnetic box. "Safe house. Protocol." The elevator dinged. The doors opened onto the concrete cavern of the loading dock. It smelled of diesel exhaust and rotting garbage. It was empty, save for a few delivery trucks and a nondescript, dirty white plumber's van parked near the compactor. "That one." Myung-Jin pointed. We moved as fast as his legs would allow. He leaned heavily on the hood of the van, sliding the magnetic box under the wheel well. It clicked. He pulled out a key. "Get in," he ordered. "You can't drive," I argued, running to the driver's side. "I can drive," he snarled, shoving me toward the passenger door. "Get in." I scrambled into the passenger seat. He fell into the driver's seat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. He jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. He slammed it into gear and stomped on the gas. The van shrieked, tires spinning on the smooth concrete, and shot toward the ramp. As we crested the exit, bursting out into the cool night air of the Seoul backstreets, I looked in the side mirror. 3 black SUVs were screeching to a halt at the front entrance of the hotel, tires smoking. Men with assault rifles were pouring out. Myung-Jin didn't look back. He merged into traffic, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, driving us into the anonymous darkness of the city. "Turn left here," Myung-Jin gritted out, his hand hovering over the van's dash. "There is a safe house in Gangnam, an automated unit." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "If they found you at the Imperial, they compromised your security protocols. They'll be watching your properties." "I have contingencies," he argued, though his voice was weak, lacking its earlier command. "Yeah? Well, my contingency is not getting shot in the face tonight," I snapped, swinging the van hard to the right, away from the glittering skyscrapers of the wealthy district and toward the shadowed, cramped streets of my neighborhood. "We're going to the one place nobody looks for a billionaire." "Where?" "The slums," I said grimly. "Because nobody cares about us down here." The building was a gray concrete monolith that had seen better decades. The streetlights flickered with a nervous buzz, casting long, jumping shadows on the peeling paint. I parked the van in the alley behind the dumpster, hoping it looked abandoned enough to be ignored. "Elevator's out," I announced as I hauled him out of the passenger seat. "Has been since the World Cup." "We're walking." "Which floor?" He groaned, leaning his entire weight on me. "Fourth." The climb was brutal. The stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage, stale cigarette smoke, and damp concrete. By the time I fumbled with my keys at 4B, Myung-Jin was barely conscious, his feet dragging. I kicked the door open and dragged him inside. My apartment was tiny, a glorified shoebox with a kitchenette. It was clean, meticulously organized, but there was no hiding the poverty. The linoleum was cracked, the windows were drafty, and the furniture was mismatched salvage. "Sit," I commanded, steering him toward the sofa. It was a hideous, second-hand thing covered in a faded floral print of pink roses. Myung-Jin collapsed onto it. The visual dissonance was jarring. Here was the Shadow King, a man of lethal violence and immense wealth, sprawled across a grandma couch, his dark tattooed skin and bloody bandages stark against the pastel flowers. He looked like a fallen god resting on a thrift store throne. "I'm bleeding on your upholstery," he murmured, looking at the dark stain spreading under his hip. "It's $5 fabric, Myung-Jin. I'll live." I knelt beside him, pushing his hands away to check the wound. I lifted the makeshift bandage. The stitches, my vodka-soaked handiwork, were angry and red, but they held. "You didn't pop them," I sighed, relief washing over me. "Miraculously." I stood up, my knees cracking. "You need food. Your body is eating itself to replace that blood." I went to the kitchenette. It was 3 steps away. Everything in this apartment was 3 steps away. I didn't have steak. I didn't have wine. I opened the fridge and stared at the contents. Spicy sausages, onions, a carton of heavy broth, potatoes, and a jar of my mother's secret spice blend that I had shipped over from the States. "Comfort food," I whispered. I got to work. I chopped the onions and sausages with a speed born of hunger, throwing them into my one good heavy pot. The sizzle filled the silence. I added the potatoes, the broth, and a generous heap of cayenne and paprika. Within 10 minutes the smell began to fill the small space. It was a rich, heavy scent, garlic, heat, and meat. It smelled like home. It smelled like safety. I glanced over at the sofa. Myung-Jin was watching me. His eyes were heavy-lidded, but they followed my every move. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking at me. I ladled the thick, red stew into 2 chipped bowls and grabbed 2 spoons. I walked over and handed him one. "It's spicy," I warned, sitting on the coffee table facing him because there was nowhere else to sit. "It'll wake you up." He took the bowl. He stared at it suspiciously, as if I might be poisoning him after saving his life. He took a small, tentative sip. His eyebrows shot up. "Good?" I asked, taking a mouthful of my own. He didn't answer. He just took another bite, then another. He ate with a sudden, ferocious intensity, the spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl. It was the first time I'd seen him look like anything other than a machine. He was just a starving man eating a hot meal. He finished and set the bowl down, a bit of color returning to his gray face. He leaned back, his gaze drifting to the small dining table pushed against the wall. It was covered in stacks of paper, bright red envelopes, legal notices, final warnings. "You have enemies?" he asked, nodding at the pile. "Debt collectors," I said, putting my bowl down. I felt the familiar weight of shame settle in my chest. Different kind of shark, same sharp teeth. "Gambling?" "Marriage," I corrected bitterly. "I was married for 5 years. I thought we were building a life. Turns out, he was building a scam. He stole my identity, took out loans in my name for businesses that didn't exist, and funneled the money offshore." I picked up one of the envelopes, twisting the corner. "He vanished 2 years ago. Left me with 6 figures of debt and a credit score so low I can't even rent a car. I work double shifts at the hotel to pay the interest. I'm paying for a life I didn't get to live." I expected him to laugh, or to offer pity. Rich men usually did one or the other. Myung-Jin didn't do either. He looked at the envelopes, then back at me. His expression was unreadable, dark and deep. "You are paying a debt of honor to a ghost," he said quietly. "I'm paying so I don't go to jail," I countered. "My parents, they think I'm successful. They think I'm running the hotel, not cleaning it. I can't let them know I was stupid enough to let a man ruin me." "It is not stupidity," he said. His voice was firm. "It is loyalty. He weaponized your virtue." He moved his hand, his fingers tracing the edge of the floral cushion. He looked down at his own chest, at the dragon tattoo that coiled over his heart. "My lieutenant," he said, the words heavy. "Minho. He sat at my table for 10 years. He guarded my sleep. He was my brother in everything but blood." He looked up, his eyes hard. "He is the one who put the bullet in my side. He sold me to the Incheon syndicate for a seat at the table." The silence in the room shifted. It wasn't the terrified silence of the hotel room, or the adrenaline-fueled silence of the closet. It was a heavy, shared silence. We were 2 people sitting in a rundown apartment, both bleeding from wounds inflicted by the people we had trusted most. His wound was physical, mine was financial. But the scar tissue felt the same. He leaned forward, wincing slightly. He reached out and covered my hand with his. His skin was rough, calloused from weapons and violence, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. His hand was large, swallowing mine completely. "We are the same, Denise," he said, using my name again. It sounded different on his tongue now. Not a command, but an acknowledgement. "We both trusted the wrong men. But you—" He squeezed my hand. The heat of his palm seeped into my cold skin. "You stitched me up with vodka and sewing thread. You walked through a kill zone to get me out. You are not a victim." He looked me dead in the eye, the intensity of his gaze making my breath hitch. "You have a warrior's spirit." I stared at him, stunned. For 2 years I had felt like a failure. A dupe. A maid cleaning up a mess she didn't make. But looking at this dangerous, broken man, feeling the strength in his hand, I didn't feel like a maid. "Eat your stew, Myung-Jin," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion I didn't want to show. "Before it gets cold." He didn't let go of my hand. "It is already the best meal I have ever had." 2 days. That was all it took for the Shadow King to rise from the dead. Most men would have been in the ICU for a week after taking a bullet to the ribs and having their abdomens sewn up with a hotel sewing kit. Myung-Jin was doing 1-armed push-ups on my living room floor by the 2nd morning. "You're going to rip your stitches," I warned, stepping over him to get to the coffee pot. "Pain is information," he grunted, lowering himself with terrifying control. "It tells me I am alive." He had spent the last 48 hours pacing the length of my tiny apartment like a caged tiger. He had sent me out to buy 3 different burner phones from 3 different bodegas. He had been making calls in rapid-fire Korean that sounded less like conversation and more like military orders. Now, he stood up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. He didn't look pale anymore. He looked focused, lethal. "Tonight," he said, grabbing a bottle of water. "It happens tonight." "What happens?" I asked, pouring my coffee into a chipped mug. "The Grand Seoul Casino opening," he said. "Min-ho, the traitor, will be there. He expects to announce my death and claim the Incheon territory. He thinks I am rotting in a sewer." He walked over to the window, peering through the blinds at the street below. "If I do not walk through those doors tonight, I lose everything. My men will scatter. My empire will be carved up. So go," I said, leaning against the counter. "You have phones. You have loyalists. Go reclaim your throne." He turned to look at me. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "I cannot walk in alone. If I enter with armed guards, it is a declaration of war. There will be a shootout in the lobby. Civilians will die." He took a step closer. "But if I walk in with a beautiful woman, if I walk in with a civilian on my arm, it is a social call. It confuses the narrative. It forces them to hesitate. They cannot shoot me in front of the press and the politicians without destroying themselves." I narrowed my eyes. "You want a human shield. I want a partner," he corrected. "I need someone I trust to watch my back while I watch the room. I do not trust my men right now. I trust the woman who stitched me up while I was bleeding out." I should have said no. I should have told him to hire an actress. But looking at him, seeing the intensity in his gaze, I felt that familiar pull. The danger was magnetic. A sharp knock at the door made us both jump. Myung-Jin's hand went instantly to the small of his back, where he had tucked the gun. "Courier," he said. "Open it." I opened the door. A terrified-looking delivery boy shoved a sleek, matte black box into my arms and bolted before I could even sign for it. I carried the box to the wobbly dining table. It was heavy, tied with a silver ribbon. "Open it," Myung-Jin commanded. I pulled the ribbon. I lifted the lid, and my breath caught in my throat. Nestled in layers of black tissue paper was a dress. But calling it a dress felt like an insult. It was a masterpiece. It was midnight blue silk, so dark it looked black until the light hit it. I pulled it out. It was liquid in my hands, sleeveless with a plunging neckline and a back that swooped down dangerously low. It came with a pair of strappy silver heels that looked like they were made of diamonds and sadism. "Put it on," he said. I looked at him. "This costs more than my student loans. It fits the role," he said, turning his back to give me privacy, though in this apartment privacy was a relative term. "Go." I took the box into the bathroom and locked the door. I stared at myself in the mirror above the sink. The glass was cracked in the corner, a spiderweb fracture from when my ex-husband had thrown a hairbrush in a fit of rage 3 years ago. I looked at the tired woman in the reflection, the dark circles, the messy bun, the stained uniform. "You are not a victim," Myung-Jin had said. I stripped off my sweats. I stepped into the silk. It slid over my skin like cool water. It fit terrifyingly well. It clung to my curves, accentuating hips I usually tried to hide and a waist I forgot I had. The slit went up to my thigh, demanding attention. I let my hair down. It was wild, curly, and thick. I didn't try to tame it. I let it be a mane. I dug through my old makeup bag, the one I hadn't touched since the divorce. I found a tube of lipstick. Ruby Woo. I applied it. The red was bold, aggressive. I looked in the mirror again. The crack was still there, but the woman reflecting back didn't look broken anymore. She looked dangerous. She looked like someone who could stand next to a dragon and not get burned. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and stepped out. Myung-Jin was standing by the window. He had changed, too. He was wearing a suit that must have been in the bottom of the courier box. It was black, tailored to perfection, hiding the bandages and the gun. He looked every inch the billionaire CEO. He heard the door open. He turned around. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He went completely still. His eyes swept over me, starting from the silver heels, traveling up the slit in the dress, lingering on the curve of my hips, and finally locking onto my face. The air seemed to leave the room, sucked out by the sheer force of his gaze. It wasn't a look of polite appreciation. It was a look of hunger. It was the way a man looks at something he intends to conquer. He walked toward me. The floorboards creaked under his expensive shoes, but I barely heard it over the pounding of my heart. He stopped inches from me. He smelled of expensive cologne, and that underlying scent of danger that never seemed to leave him. "Turn around," he whispered. I obeyed. I felt the cold metal of a chain touch my neck. He fastened a necklace, a simple, devastating solitaire diamond that rested right at the hollow of my throat. His fingers lingered on the nape of my neck. His skin was hot. He leaned in close. His chest brushed against my bare back. I could feel the heat radiating through the thin silk. "Listen to me, Denise," he murmured, his mouth hovering just behind my ear. His voice was low, a rough vibration that went straight to my core. "Tonight, we are walking into a den of vipers. They will look for fear. They will look for weakness." His hand slid from my neck, down to my bare shoulder, his thumb pressing into my skin possessively. "Tonight, you are not a maid. You are not a woman drowning in debt. You are not a victim." He turned me around so I was facing him. He gripped my chin, tilting my head up so I had to look into those abyss-black eyes. "You are the woman who tamed the dragon," he said, his voice fierce. "Walk like you own the place. Walk like you own me." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling slightly at my sides. "And if they talk to me?" "You don't answer," he said, his thumb brushing my bottom lip, smearing the red slightly. "Queens do not explain themselves to peasants." He offered me his arm. The fabric of his suit was smooth, but the muscle beneath it was hard as rock. "Ready?" he asked. I looked at the shabby apartment one last time. The peeling paint, the debt notices on the table, the cracked linoleum. Then I looked at him. "Let's go break some fingers," I said. A corner of his mouth ticked up. A smirk. "That's my girl." The window of the black limousine was tinted so dark it felt like midnight inside, but I could still see the explosions of light against the glass. Flash. 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 "Ready?" Myung-Jin asked. I looked at him. In the dim light of the car, he was terrifyingly beautiful. The bandages were hidden beneath a tuxedo that cost more than my parents' house. His hair was slicked back, severe and elegant, revealing the sharp angles of his face. He didn't look like a man who had been eating spicy stew in a slum 2 hours ago. He looked like a king coming to claim a blood debt. "I feel like I'm going to throw up," I admitted, clutching my beaded clutch so hard I thought the clasp might snap. "Good," he said, his voice smooth as velvet. "Nerves keep you sharp. Just remember, you are above them. Look through them, not at them." The driver opened the door. The sound hit us first, a wall of noise. Shouts, camera shutters clicking like a swarm of cicadas, the roar of the city. Then the light. It was blinding. Myung-Jin stepped out first. He buttoned his jacket, scanned the perimeter once with those predator eyes, and then reached a hand back for me. I took it. His grip was firm, warm, and grounding. I stepped out onto the red carpet. The air was cool, but the atmosphere was boiling. "Who is she?" "Is that the chairman?" I thought he was dead. "Look at the dress." We moved toward the massive golden doors of the Grand Seoul Casino. Myung-Jin didn't rush. He walked with a slow, deliberate cadence that forced everyone else to adjust to his rhythm. He placed his hand on the small of my back, skin on skin. His thumb rubbed slow, possessive circles against my spine. It was a claim, a brand. We walked through the doors and into the VIP hall. If the outside was chaotic, the inside was a temple of excess. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars dripped from the ceiling. The air smelled of money, expensive perfume, and the faint underlying ozone of high-stakes tension. A live jazz band was playing something smooth and sultry in the corner. As we stepped onto the main floor, the room seemed to tilt. It started near the entrance. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered. The silence rippled outward like a wave, until the entire cavernous room went quiet. Even the band trailed off, the saxophone player lowering his instrument in confusion. Myung-Jin didn't stop. He guided me through the parting crowd. He didn't look left or right. He looked straight ahead, toward the raised dais where the host was standing. Min-ho, the traitor, the man who had shot him. He was holding a champagne flute, laughing at something the Minister of Justice was saying. Then he saw us. The color drained from his face so fast it looked like a physical blow. His smile froze, turning into a rictus of terror. The glass in his hand tilted, spilling expensive vintage champagne onto his polished shoes. But he didn't even notice. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. Myung-Jin smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a shark scenting blood in the water. "Keep walking," Myung-Jin whispered to me, his lips barely moving. "Don't look at him yet. Let him sweat." We were intercepted before we reached the dais. A man stepped into our path. He was shorter than Myung-Jin, wider, with a face that looked like it had been molded from wet dough. He wore a flashy maroon suit and too many gold rings. Director Choi, the snake. He didn't look at Myung-Jin. He looked at me. Well, Choi purred, his voice oily. We heard rumors the Shadow King had fallen, but it seems he was just distracted. He stepped closer, invading my personal space. Myung-Jin stopped, his body going unnaturally still beside me. Choi grinned, his eyes raking over my dress, lingering on the plunge of the neckline. He reached out and ran a finger down my bare arm, from my shoulder to my elbow. His skin was damp and cold. I shuddered, fighting the urge to recoil. "Lovely thing," Choi murmured, ignoring the lethal tension radiating off Myung-Jin. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of cognac and cigars. "Tell me, darling, how much did he pay for the hour? Or does he rent you by the night?" The insult hung in the air, gross and heavy. I opened my mouth to snap back, to tell him to go to hell, but I never got the chance. Myung-Jin didn't shout. He didn't posture. He moved faster than my eyes could track. 1 second, Choi's hand was on my arm. The next, Myung-Jin had seized Choi's index finger, the one touching me, in his fist. He didn't just bend it. He snapped it. Crack. The sound was sickeningly loud, like a dry branch snapped in a winter forest. It echoed off the marble floors and the crystal chandeliers. "Ah!" Choi screamed. It was a high, thin sound of pure agony. He dropped to his knees, his body contorting as Myung-Jin held onto the broken finger, forcing him down, until his forehead was touching the polished floor. The room gasped. A collective intake of breath. The Minister of Justice spilled his drink. Security guards took a step forward, hands reaching for earpieces or holsters, but they stopped dead when Myung-Jin lifted his head. He looked at the guards. Then he looked down at the whimpering man at my feet. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. He released the finger, letting Choi collapse fully onto the floor, clutching his hand and sobbing. Myung-Jin wiped his hand on a silk handkerchief he pulled from his pocket, as if he had touched something filthy. "Touch my property again," Myung-Jin said, his voice calm, clear, and carrying to every corner of the silent room, "and you lose the hand." He tossed the handkerchief onto Choi's heaving back. Then he turned to me. The darkness in his eyes was swirling, a mix of violence and something else, something hot and heavy that made my knees weak. He reached out and adjusted the diamond necklace at my throat, his knuckles brushing my pulse point. My heart was hammering so hard I knew he could feel it. I should have been horrified. I should have been running for the exit. I was a housekeeping supervisor. I didn't deal with broken bones and mob wars. But God help me, I wasn't running. I was looking at him, and the rush of adrenaline was mixing with a sudden, overwhelming wave of arousal. He had just brought a powerful man to his knees for touching my arm. I felt protected. I felt cherished, in the most twisted, violent way possible. "Come," he said softly. He slipped his arm around my waist again, pulling me tight against his side. We stepped over the sobbing Director Choi. The crowd parted instantly. This time there were no whispers. There was only fear and awe. Myung-Jin led me past the pale, shaking Min-ho, who didn't dare say a word, and straight to the private elevator at the back of the room. He pressed the button. The gold doors slid open, We stepped inside. As the doors closed, shutting out the sight of the stunned ballroom, Myung-Jin didn't look at the floor indicator. He turned to me, backing me up against the mirrored wall of the elevator until there was nowhere left to go. The golden doors of the elevator clicked shut, sealing us in a box of mirrors and silence. The rest of the world, the screaming director Choi, the stunned politicians, the flashing cameras, disappeared. It was just us, and the adrenaline was a physical thing in the air, electric and sharp. Myung-Jin didn't wait. He didn't speak. He turned on his heel, grabbed me by the waist, and slammed me back against the mirrored wall. The glass was cool against my bare back, but his body was an inferno. His hands tangled in my hair, tilting my head back, and his mouth crashed down on mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It wasn't sweet. It was desperate. It was rough. It tasted of violence and possession. It was the kiss of a man who had just walked through fire and dragged me out with him. I gasped, my hands finding purchase on the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer. I should have been afraid. I should have pushed him away. But the image of him snapping a man's finger for touching me was burned into my retinas, and God help me, it had ignited something primal. I kissed him back with everything I had. I bit his lip. He groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated against my mouth. His hands roamed over the silk dress, tracing the curves of my body, claiming every inch of skin he had exposed. For a moment, suspended between floors, we weren't a maid and a mob boss. We were just two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage. Ding! The elevator chimed, a cheerful, mundane sound that shattered the moment like a hammer hitting glass. The doors slid open. Myung-Jin pulled back instantly. The loss of his heat was shocking, like being doused in ice water. He straightened his tie, smoothed his jacket, and stepped out of the elevator. We weren't in a hallway. We were in the penthouse, his penthouse. And it was full of men. Secure the perimeter. Myung-Jin barked, his voice dropping instantly into the command tone that brooked no argument. Lock down the elevators. I want a sweep of the perimeter. If Minho breathes in this postcode, I want to know about it. 6 men in dark suits snapped to attention. They were armed. They were serious. And they looked at Myung-Jin with absolute reverence. The king had returned. I stood in the elevator doorway, my lips swollen, my hair messy, my chest heaving. I felt suddenly exposed. The silk dress felt less like armor and more like a costume. Myung-Jin didn't look at me. He walked to a massive mahogany desk overlooking the city skyline and started issuing orders to a man with an earpiece. I stepped into the room, hugging my arms around myself. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a trembling exhaustion. Bzzz. The burner phone in my clutch vibrated. I frowned. Nobody had this number except Myung-Jin. I pulled it out. It wasn't a text from him. It was a notification from the encrypted banking app he had installed on the phone for emergencies. Message from Singapore Holdings LLC. Subject, wire transfer complete. I tapped it open. My breath hitched. Debt cleared, $112 in full. Credit, plus $500,000 USD. Memo, consulting fee/services rendered. I stared at the screen. The numbers blurred. $500,000. It was more money than I would make in 20 years of scrubbing toilets. It was freedom. It was a fresh start. It was everything I had dreamed of while crying over unpaid bills at $3 am. But then I saw the memo again. Services rendered. The words echoed in my head, mixing with Director Choi's oily voice from the casino floor. How much did he pay for the hour, darling? My stomach dropped. The heat of the kiss, the intimacy of the safe house, the way he had looked at me when he put the necklace on, it all suddenly felt cold, transactional. I felt cheap. I felt like a prop he had rented to make a point. Myung-Jin, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. He looked up from the desk. He held up a hand to his head of security, silencing the man mid-sentence. Denise, he said. His face was a mask. The passion from the elevator was gone, locked away behind a wall of indifference. My men will escort you home. It is not safe for you here. I walked toward the desk, holding the phone out like a weapon. What is this? I demanded, my hand shaking. He glanced at the screen, then back at me. His expression didn't change. Your payment. Payment? I choked out. For what? For stitching you up? For pretending to be your girlfriend? Or for what happened in the elevator? The room went deadly silent. The guards looked away, uncomfortable. Myung-Jin stood up. He walked around the desk. He stopped 3 feet away from me. He looked at me, but his eyes were dead. They were the eyes of the statue I had first met in the shower. We had a transaction, he said coldly. You saved my life. You provided a service. I pay my debts. That is the rule of my world. A service, I repeated, the word tasting like ash. Is that all I was to you? A nurse? A human shield? I searched his face, desperate for a crack in the armor. I wanted him to tell me I was wrong. I wanted him to tell me that the connection in the apartment, the shared scars, the stew, the hand-holding, was real. But he didn't. He knew something I didn't. He knew that Min-ho was desperate. He knew that a war was coming that would burn Seoul to the ground. He knew that if I stayed within 10 feet of him, I would be a target. A leverage point. A weakness. To save me, he had to break me. You were useful, he said, his voice flat and cruel. You have steady hands and you know the hotel layout. But the job is done. I have reclaimed my position. He gestured to the phone in my hand. The money is yours. It is more than you are worth. Take it. Tears pricked my eyes. Hot, angry tears. I didn't do it for the money. I did, he said. Everyone has a price, Denise. You just found yours. He turned his back on me. Go back to your mop. Go back to your life. You don't belong here. The insult slapped me harder than any physical blow could have. Go back to your mop. The anger flared white-hot, burning away the hurt. I took 2 steps forward, grabbed his shoulder, and spun him around. Smack. I slapped him. I put my entire body into it, channeling 2 years of frustration, 2 days of terror, and 5 minutes of heartbreak into my right hand. The sound cracked through the penthouse like a gunshot. His head snapped to the side. A red mark bloomed instantly on his cheek. The guards surged forward, hands on their weapons. Stop. Myung-Jin roared, holding up a hand. He didn't look at them. He looked at me. He slowly turned his face back to mine. He didn't look angry. For a split second, I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. A deep, jagged regret. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He touched his cheek with his tongue, tasting the copper of a split lip. Get out, he whispered. I stared at him, my chest heaving, my hands stinging. I realized then that no matter how much money was in my bank account, I had lost something much more valuable. I hope it was worth it, I spat. Your kingdom. I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I walked. I walked past the armed guards, past the mahogany desk, and back into the elevator. The doors closed, shutting him out. As the elevator began its long, silent descent to the lobby, I slid down the mirrored wall until I hit the floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, burying my face in the expensive silk dress he had bought me. I was debt-free. I was rich. I was safe. And as I sobbed into the silence, I realized I would give every single penny back just to have him look at me one more time like I was the woman who tamed the dragon. 1 week. 7 days. 168 hours. That's how long I had been rich. I stood in the produce aisle of an upscale organic grocery store in Gangnam, staring at a cantaloupe that cost $20. I was wearing a cashmere sweater I hadn't looked at the price tag for. My hair was done. My nails were manicured. My debt was 0. I had never been more miserable in my life. I poked the melon. It felt firm. Everything in my new life felt firm, polished, and safe, and it was boring. It was agonizingly, soul-crushingly boring. I missed the smell of sandalwood and gunpowder. I missed the way the air seemed to vibrate when he walked into a room. I missed the fear, because the fear meant I was alive. You're an idiot, Denise, I muttered to the fruit, tossing it into my cart. I pushed the cart out to the parking lot. It was a gray afternoon, the sky threatening rain. I unlocked my new car, a sensible, safe sedan, and opened the trunk. I heard the tires screech before I saw the van. It was a black panel van, tearing around the corner with reckless speed. It slammed on its brakes right behind me, blocking me in. My stomach dropped, not with fear, but with recognition. Finally, the side door slid open. 3 men jumped out. They wore ski masks and dark tactical gear. I didn't scream. I swung the bag of groceries. A heavy jar of artisan pasta sauce connected with the first man's head with a satisfying thud. He grunted, stumbling back. "Get off me," I shouted, kicking out at the second one. But there were 3 of them, and I was just a housekeeping supervisor with a jar of sauce. Rough hands grabbed my arms. A cloth smelling of sickly sweet chemicals was jammed over my nose and mouth. I held my breath, fighting, scratching at the leather gloves. But the world started to swim. My knees gave out. The last thing I saw was the gray sky spinning above me before the darkness swallowed me whole. I woke up to the smell of rust and old oil. My head was pounding a rhythm that matched the throbbing in my wrists. I was tied to a chair. My hands were bound behind me with zip ties that bit into my skin. I blinked, my vision clearing. I was in a warehouse. A cliche, I thought hysterically. A dusty, abandoned warehouse with high windows and concrete floors. "You're awake." I looked up. Standing in front of me was Minho, Myung-Jin's brother, the traitor. He looked terrible. His suit was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He was pacing back and forth like a rat trapped in a maze. "He paid you off," Minho muttered, more to himself than to me. He stopped and pointed a shaking finger at me. "He sent you away. He thought he was being clever. She is nothing," he told his captains. "Just a transaction." He laughed, a jagged, desperate sound. But I saw him at the casino. I saw his eyes. The Shadow King doesn't break fingers for a transaction. He doesn't look at a whore the way he looked at you. He grabbed my chin, his fingers digging in. "You are his weakness, and I am going to squeeze until he breaks." He pulled out a phone. He dialed a number and held it up, switching it to video call. Myung-Jin sat at the head of a 30-foot granite table. He was listening to a report on shipping logistics, his face a mask of bored indifference. He hadn't slept in a week. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Denise's face in the elevator. He saw the hurt in her eyes before she slapped him. His phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number. He silenced the room with a raised hand. He tapped answer. The screen filled with a grainy image. A woman tied to a chair. Her hair was messy, her lip was cut, and her eyes were wide with terror. Denise. A gun barrel entered the frame, pressing against her temple. "Hello, brother," Minho's voice crackled through the speaker. "I think you lost something." The boardroom went so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Myung-Jin didn't scream. He didn't negotiate. He didn't ask what Minho wanted. A terrifying stillness settled over him. It was the stillness of a tsunami drawing back the water before the wave hits. His eyes went completely dead. He stood up. He picked up the phone. "I will find you," Myung-Jin said. His voice wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was a fact, like gravity. "If you want her alive," Minho started. Myung-Jin ended the call. He looked at his head of security. "Track the signal." "Sir, it's bouncing off. Track it." Myung-Jin roared, flipping the heavy granite table. Papers and laptops flew. The veneer of the businessman shattered, revealing the monster beneath. "Find the location. Now." 30 seconds later. West Incheon Industrial District. Warehouse 4. Myung-Jin walked to the door, buttoning his jacket. "Get the cars. Get the heavy weapons." "What are the orders, sir? Do we negotiate?" Myung-Jin turned back. His eyes were burning with a cold black fire. "Burn it down," he said. "Leave no one alive." Minho was pacing again. He hung up. Why did he hang up? He should be begging. I spat blood onto the concrete floor. "You don't know him at all, do you?" "Shut up." He's not negotiating, I said, a dark satisfaction curling in my gut despite the gun pointed at me. He's coming. And then, the wall exploded. There was no warning, no knock. Just a deafening crash as a matte black armored SUV smashed through the corrugated metal wall of the warehouse, sending sheet metal and concrete flying like shrapnel. Dust billowed out, choking the air. Minho screamed, diving for cover. The men guarding me raised their rifles, firing blindly into the dust cloud. The driver's door of the SUV kicked open. Myung-Jin stepped out. He was a demon rising from hell smoke. He held a submachine gun in each hand. He didn't take cover. He walked forward, the muzzle flashes lighting up the gloom. Rat-tat-tat-tat. 2 guards dropped instantly. Kill her. Minho shrieked from behind a crate. Kill the girl. A massive guard, the one who had been holding the gun to my head, grabbed the back of my chair and dragged me backward, using me as a human shield. He pressed the barrel of his pistol into my neck. Drop it. The guard screamed at Myung-Jin. Or she dies. Myung-Jin froze. He was 20 feet away. He was covered in dust, his suit torn. He locked eyes with me. He couldn't shoot. The angle was bad. I looked at Myung-Jin. I saw the fear in his eyes, the only time I had ever seen him truly afraid. He was powerless. You are a warrior, he had told me. I wasn't a damsel. I wasn't a transaction. I took a deep breath. I slammed my head backward, smashing my skull into the guard's nose. Crunch. He howled in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It wasn't enough to break free, but it was enough. I twisted my body and sank my teeth into his forearm, biting down until I tasted blood. He jerked his arm back, the gun moving away from my neck. Bang. Myung-Jin didn't hesitate. 1 shot. The guard's head snapped back. He crumpled to the floor, dragging the chair down with him. I hit the concrete hard, breathless, but alive. Myung-Jin was moving again. He vaulted over a crate, dropping the guns. He pulled a knife from his belt. Minho scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, holding up his hands. Brother. Wait. We can talk. I can explain. Myung-Jin didn't slow down. He didn't say a word. There was no monologue, no final judgment. He stepped into Minho's space, deflected a desperate punch, and drove the knife into Minho's chest. Once. Twice. Minho gasped, his eyes wide. He slumped to the floor. It was over. The silence rushed back in, heavy and ringing. Myung-Jin stood over the body for a second, his chest heaving. Then he dropped the knife. Denise. He scrambled toward me, falling to his knees in the dust and glass. His hands, those lethal, steady hands, were shaking uncontrollably. He pulled a smaller knife from his boot and slashed the zip ties on my wrists. Denise, he gasped, pulling me up. He ran his hands over my face, my arms, checking for bullet holes. He was frantic, desperate. Are you hurt? Did they touch you? I shook my head, tears finally spilling over. I'm okay. I'm okay. He pulled me into his chest. He buried his face in my neck, holding me so tight it hurt. I could feel him trembling. The great Shadow King, the man who had just slaughtered a dozen men, was shaking apart in my arms. I tried, he choked out, his voice broken. I tried to send you away. I tried to keep you safe from this. From me. I pulled back. I grabbed his face between my hands. My palms were dirty, staining his skin. But he didn't care. You idiot, I sobbed, laughing through the tears. You can't send me away. I looked at the carnage around us, then back into his dark, terrified eyes. Look at this mess you made, I whispered. I'm the only one who knows how to stitch you up. He stared at me for a long heartbeat. Then, he crushed his mouth to mine. It tasted of dust, and blood, and forever. 6 months. That's how long it had been since I dragged a squeaky cleaning cart across the marble floors of the Grand Seoul Imperial Hotel. Today, the marble was the same, but the shoes walking on it were very different. I stepped through the revolving doors, the heels of my crimson-red tailored suit clicking with authority. The lobby was bustling, suitcases rolling, guests laughing, chandeliers sparkling. As I passed the concierge desk, the chatter stopped. The staff straightened their spines. Mr. Park, the head concierge who used to scold me for being 2 minutes late, bowed low. "Good morning, Madam Owner," he said, respect coloring every syllable. "Good morning, Mr. Park," I smiled, not breaking my stride. "Make sure the fresh flowers in the lobby are changed by noon. The lilies are wilting. Immediately, Madam." I walked past the elevators, past the service entrance I used to sneak through, and straight into the executive office. I threw my bag onto the leather sofa and sat behind the massive oak desk. I picked up the quarterly report. Profits were up 20%. The door handle turned, then the distinct click of the lock engaging. I didn't look up. A smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. "You can't just barge in here without an appointment. I'm a busy woman. I own the building." A deep, familiar voice rumbled. "I don't need an appointment." I looked up. Myung-Jin was leaning against the door. He looked healthy. The gray pallor was gone, replaced by a golden tan. He was wearing a navy suit, the top button of his shirt undone, revealing just a hint of the dragon tattoo at his throat. He looked dangerous, powerful, and entirely at peace. "Is the hotel up to your standards?" he asked, walking slowly toward the desk. "The hotel is fine," I said, leaning back in my chair, tapping a pen against my lips. "But I have a formal complaint about a guest in the presidential suite. He keeps stealing the general manager during working hours." Myung-Jin stopped at the edge of the desk. His eyes darkened with that familiar hungry heat. "Stealing?" he murmured. In one fluid motion he reached out, swept the stack of quarterly reports off the desk, and scattered them across the floor. Before I could gasp, he grabbed me by the waist and lifted me effortlessly onto the mahogany surface. He stepped between my knees, his hands resting on my thighs, his thumb brushing the fabric of my suit. "I don't steal, Denise," he whispered, leaning in until his lips brushed mine. "I claim what is mine." He kissed me, and for the 1,000th time, I thanked the universe for the day I walked into the wrong room. And that, my friends, is how you survive the wrong room. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and subscribe to Evie's Mafia romance collections. Let me know in the comments, would you stitch him up or run? Until next time, stay dangerous.
Watching from the UK, I got hooked a few moments into the story. I'll be definitely be playing catch up on all your stories.